Welcome everyone to the Hamilton City Schools 2025 organizational meeting. It's Thursday, January 9th, 2025. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'll now call the roll. Mrs. Baker?
Here.
Mr. Davidson?
Here.
Dr. Kopus?
Here.
Mrs. Matthews?
Here.
Mr. Sprague?
Here. I'd like to make a motion. I'd move that we appoint treasurer as the president pro tempore to preside over the election of the president.
Second.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Dr. Kopus?
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews?
Yes.
Mr. Sprague?
Yes.
I'd like to make a motion for the president, election of board president. Mrs. Matthews?
Second that. I would like to make a motion, if I could, for Mr. Davidson as board president.
Okay. Similar to last year, oh, do we have a second for that?
Second.
Okay. Similar to last year, when there's multiple nominations on the floor, we will take a vote by naming the individual you'd like for president. Mr. Sprague.
Mrs. Matthews.
Mr.
Have
Davidson.
a discussion first?
We can, absolutely. Discussion.
All right, last year, we were in the same situation. I nominated, actually, last year, Mrs. Matthews, and she said she didn't want to be president. But why, all of a sudden, now do you want to be president after a year?
Because the time seems right.
I have some comments I'd like to make. First thing I'd like to say is I wish that we as a board would have chosen to discuss these things in private. Maybe we're not allowed to do that, but anyway, we didn't do that. So if it has to be discussed in open forum, then so be it. I do want to say that, in my opinion, I'm for discussing everything openly and honestly, and in my opinion, the position as board president is something that's an honored position. That's an important position, and I think that has to be earned and deserved. And frankly, at this point, I don't think Ms. Matthews has earned that. And let me explain my reasoning for that. If you look at attendance, and you can verify these things, Mrs. Matthews, I'm pretty certain, had the worst attendance last year of any board member. And I know for a fact that there were a number of meetings when Mrs. Baker, before the meeting, would call her to remind her there's a meeting, or if she's on her way, or if she's going to be on time. And that's okay. I mean, I know Mrs. Baker was trying to mentor her, and that's fine. I respect that. But my stance on that is this. I'm a practicing clinician. If I can be here on time, I expect everyone to be here on time. So that's one issue I have. Another issue that I have, and again, this, most of us have experienced this, at after-hour events, the board is invited to a number of these. And even after Mrs. Matthews had made some commitments to attend certain events, and the district had bought tickets or dinners or whatever we had to financially support, she wasn't there. And I know that to be a fact because I attended a number of those. So I think that's an issue we need to consider also. Another thing I would say is, and correct me if I'm wrong here because I'm not certain of this, but Mrs. Matthews was the board rep to 17 Strong. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, were you also the board rep to Butler Tech?
That's correct.
Well, I would tell you, now I don't know about the other members, but during the entire calendar year of '24, I never received a single update from any or either of those organizations. I don't know. That doesn't look favorably, in my opinion. I think that's an issue that you need to look at also. I think the position of board president should be awarded to the person that is most capable and most deserving. And right now, I just don't feel that that's Mrs. Matthews. And you know, if we wanted to be honest about it and tell the whole truth, and Mrs. Baker, I thought, did a nice job of handling this, we actually recently enacted a cell phone usage policy for board members. And it was because of Mrs. Matthews' use of the cell phone during board members, or I'm sorry, during board meetings. I think that when we are here, we need to be fully engaged. And, you know, we're going to enact a cell phone policy for our staff and our students. I think board members ought to set the example. So those are issues that I have, and that's why I nominated Mr. Davidson. I think he's the most deserving and the most capable at this point.
Do we have any further discussion?
Well, I think, you know, you have your right to, you know, your statement. But I mean, if we're being honest, you know, if I would have been perfect all across the board and dotted every I and crossed every T, you would have never voted for me anyway. And you've always made things, directed everything towards me anyway. It seems like you've always had a chip on your shoulder with me from the day you stepped on this board. If I'm being honest, so. With that said, and then not getting into the particulars or my personal life or my business to discuss that in an open forum or with you, because that probably wouldn't be any concern. You know, you probably wouldn't be truly concerned about me and my well-being anyway. But far as to sit there and say, you know, who's deserving and who's not deserving, and without having the full picture or the full story, when you have my personal phone number, you have my email, you could have contacted me at any given time to have any kind of conversations or discussions that you would have liked to have with me, or question anything that you had about me or that I did or didn't do. So you could have made that phone call, but you did not as my fellow board member, which is fine. But you know, I've always, and I agree with you, to serve as board president is a very honored position. And I do take this being a very serious, you know, something very serious that I take being a part of my life, because it does absorb time and something that you'll never get back. And I do, you know, it's been an honor to be able to serve this city, this district, and most certainly the kids that, you know, that are in our district. So I love being a part of this board and representing Hamilton City Schools in just my current capacity. So this was never, being a part of the board was never about anything else, any agenda, anything to try to, you know, do anything that was outside of the position, but just nothing but just to impact the city and represent my neighborhood and just the youth as a whole. So that was all this was ever about from the first moment that I had a discussion. God rest his beautiful soul, Mr. Tom Alf, that he discussed with me about it, about ever even considering being on the school board. So that was always my motive, my agenda. So, yeah, I just wanted just to state that. But yeah, it's definitely an honor to serve on this board. And, you know, and you're right, Mag has been an amazing mentor to me and someone who I've always looked up to, as well as, you know, all of you on this board. So I've looked up to, you know, everyone on this board in their capacity, even yourself. So I appreciate this opportunity just to be able to share that piece.
Well, and my last comment would be, Mrs. Matthews, if you are under the impression that I am somehow inherently against you, you are mistaken. That's not the case. If, in fact, you are elected board president, I just want you to know I expect a high standard of conduct. And if I don't see that, I intend to call you on it. So just be prepared.
Any further discussion?
No.
Mr. Sprague?
Mrs. Matthews.
Mr. Davidson?
Mrs. Matthews?
Mrs. Baker?
Mrs. Matthews?
Mrs. Matthews?
Myself, Shaquille.
Dr. Kopus?
I would vote for Mr. Davidson.
Motion passes. Mrs. Matthews is the new president.
Thank you.
Madam President, show's yours.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. I would like to take a motion for board vice president.
I'd like to make a motion for Dave Davidson.
I second the motion.
Dr. Kopus, or any discussion? Dr. Kopus?
Yeah, Mr. Davidson.
Mrs. Matthews?
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Sprague?
Mr. Davidson.
Mrs. Baker?
Mr. Davidson?
Mr. Davidson.
Davidson. Madam President, before we move on,
Yes, sir.
I'd like to thank Mrs. Baker for the last 2 years and
Yes.
she put a lot of time in, and I know it hasn't been a smooth ride, but she did a great job, and I appreciate it, and I know we all do. Take the opportunity to tell her thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, appreciate that. It's been a pleasure and it's been an honor.
Same, I want to say thank you so much for your leadership, and as I stated before, being such a great mentor for me, just someone to look up to just every day, and just all your wisdom and all your knowledge is just everything. And so I really appreciate you and just your service to this board and just being such a great, strong leader. So I appreciate it.
You're absolutely welcome. I love to mentor women.
Yes.
In particular, so thank you.
Absolutely. So we'll move on to establish our, is meeting dates or? Yep, establishing meeting dates for our, so do I read the, what's in red? Yep. So according to section 3313.15 of the Ohio Revised Code requires the Board of Education to determine a time for holding its regular meetings. The regular meetings shall be held at least once every 2 months commencing January 1, 2025. The Hamilton City School District Board of Education regular meetings shall be held on the dates and times provided to each individual in attendance. All information is available on the district website in the board docs agenda. All regular meetings are scheduled to take place at 533 Dayton Street, Hamilton, Ohio, unless otherwise noted. The president may change the meeting times and place by notifying the treasurer, who shall immediately post the change and inform the media. Special meetings may be called by the president, treasurer, or any two board members by serving a signed written notice of the time, location, and purpose of the special meeting at least 2 days before such meeting in compliance with section 3313.16 of the Ohio Revised Code. Could I get a motion?
I'll make that motion.
I'll second.
I have a point of discussion about the board dates, just a question. If we, and by the way, at our board retreat, when we were discussing these dates, I do appreciate the board being willing to change some of the dates to accommodate Mr. Davidson and myself, since we're still working in the mornings during the summer. But specifically, let's look, and maybe I made a mistake here, specifically, let's look at Thursday, July the 10th. I still have the board meeting time as 9 a.m. Is there a reason we didn't change that to Friday?
Yes, if you remember Ohio Revised Code, that is the last day that a teacher can get out of their contract if we are hiring. So that was the only one that we could not move to Friday morning.
And Mrs. Blevins, thank you. I know you're correct. I do remember that. Thank you.
Also, we'll have a nomination for our board member for our planning commission.
I nominate, oh,
Oh, I'm sorry.
oh, sorry.
I'll call the roll.
I messed you up.
And this is for the meeting
Meeting
dates.
dates.
Mrs. Matthews,
Yes.
Mr. Sprague,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Dr. Kopus.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. We'll take a nomination for the board member for the city planning commission.
I nominate Mr. Davidson.
Second.
Second. If you're willing to serve.
Oh, I enjoy it.
Okay.
I do.
Any discussion? Mr. Sprague,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Dr. Kopus,
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews.
Yes. Okay. Our next item on our agenda is establishing our board members' compensation. And this nomination is discussed on a vote for our compensation for the 2025 calendar year.
I would make a motion that we forego any compensation.
I second that motion.
Just discussion, I brought this up last year. We are probably, and I don't have the numbers, but one of the few school districts in the state that does not compensate board members. It is, according to Ohio Revised Code, that we can. If we would start to do that, it doesn't affect anybody here at this table. But I do think At some point, it would make a lot of sense to, you know, compensate board members for the time. I mean, as everybody knows, it is a lot of time if you take this job and understand all of the intricacies of it. So I'm just saying, laying that on the table.
Do we have any idea how much board members in other districts are?
I think it's
I believe
anywhere
the max is $125.
per meeting. Which is just, you know, a little bit more than, or a little bit less than what the city council makes at $300 a year.
We won't go there.
Yeah, we won't go there.
I'll now call the roll. Mrs. Baker,
I'm gonna say no.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Dr. Kopus,
Well, I want to make sure I understand how I'm voting. If I vote yes, that means I am supporting no compensation.
that's correct.
Then yes.
Mrs. Matthews,
No.
Mr. Sprague,
Yes.
motion passes.
Our next item on our agenda is establishing a service fund for board members. It is recommended that the board establish a service fund beginning July 1, 2025 for $20,000 for the fiscal year 2026 to provide board members expenses according to Section 13.5 of the Ohio Revised Code. Do we have any discussion?
I'll make a motion.
I have a question.
We have to do the motion.
Motion.
Second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Now you can have discussion.
Yeah, you can have discussion.
Question, Mr. Frazier, that is the normal amount on an annual basis, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank
Yeah, that's something that we set up every year.
How much is used, of that fund has been used in the past? I
I'd
want
have
to say
do a little
probably
research.
zero.
I mean, I could run a quick report and share it with you, but I don't think it's a whole lot.
Is there leeway within the revised code that allows for a limit? Like if, I know that right now it appears that we vote whenever there's a conference or anything like that, when somebody does.
Correct.
Do we have the flexibility that we can provide like 500, let's say $500 without it coming to the board for a vote?
I'm not aware of a limit, but I will say, in order to get reimbursed for an event that you would attend, that is part of our policy that does require a board vote.
Okay,
You could adopt a new policy. if that's-
yeah, that's where I'm going instead of,
Yeah, we've set this up every year since who knows when. I don't know that we used a whole lot of it because most of it comes in the form of like going to Capitol Conference. And for the past several years, the members haven't actually attended Capitol Conference. That's usually the major expense.
I was just thinking if there's workshops or something like that, that somebody would want to attend, and there's not enough time for a board approval, or it seems if it's not a huge expense, and whatever huge is, you know, that you would have some flexibility to attend.
I mean, you could vote to reimburse at any point in time, after the fact, if you wanted to. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to do that, have that vote beforehand.
Okay, all right.
Well, one thing that I will say about that is that when that did come up this year, we kind of set a little bit of a precedent on that when, I mean, there's national conferences, there's all things that I think that we need, as a board, need to have a discussion on what's appropriate. If you want to go, that's all I'm saying is, what do we think is appropriate for us to attend?
What if we were to propose on a future work session, putting the policy on there, and we can discuss
Yeah,
that?
I think that makes
To see if
sense.
there's any parameters
Yeah.
that we want to look at reviewing.
I think
While
that
we're on
makes
that
sense.
subject, Hamilton used to be really involved on a state level. Well, we used to be very involved on a state level with the school association, board association. And we haven't in the past few years, and I think we need to do that again. And we used to be very active, twisting the arms of legislators, too. I mean, I can remember Glenn Stitzener going up and testifying in committees and stuff. And I think we need to get back to that, because it helps our district. And that's where this fund would be, to reimburse travel to go up to testify at the State House on legislation.
I don't disagree. I think part of the reasons there's been a historical issue in the past few years and with the Columbus, and I think that's why we sort of I think we started shying away from it for a couple years, and then that just continued on instead of taking advantage of it. I agree, yeah.
And we can put those dates out very early. They already have next year's Capitol Conference. I think that'd be I know Dr. Kopis at one point asked me for a little information on the Capitol Conference. Maybe that's a good start for our board, is to start having representation there. I know that's something that Jeremy, Mike, and myself attend and get a lot out of. I think there's a lot of good sessions, especially geared towards board members. There are many sessions.
Breakout sessions are very important.
They are, and there's a lot of networking and talking to other board members about their experience and working together. So I can provide that information, but I will put on a future work session, maybe, we don't have a building presentation at the January 23rd meeting, so I can put that policy on there in work session and just have a discussion,
That makes sense.
okay?
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Dr. Kopis?
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews?
Yes.
Mr. Sprague?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
We'll move on to item J, approving consultant agreement with OSBA Legal Assistance Fund. Whereas the Hamilton City School District Board of Education wishes to support the efforts of other boards of education to obtain favorable judicial decisions, and whereas the Ohio School Board Association Legal Assistance Fund has been established for this purpose, therefore, the board hereby resolves to enter into a consultant agreement with the OSBA Legal Assistance Fund for the 2025 and directs the treasurer to pay the legal assistance fund $250 for the annual consulting fee. I'll take a motion for that.
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Any discussion? Jeremy, if you can call the roll.
Dr. Kopis?
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews?
Yes.
Mr. Sprague?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Thank you. We'll move on to item K, district legal counsel representation. It is recommended that the Board of Education approve the continued use of Bricker Graydon as its primary legal counsel for the 2025 calendar year. Do I have a motion for that?
So moved.
Second.
Do we have any discussion? Jeremy?
Mrs. Matthews?
Yes.
Mr. Sprague?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Dr. Kopis?
Yes.
Also, our next item on the agenda is our tax budget. A motion to approve the fiscal year 2026 tax budget as presented. I'll take a motion on that.
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Any discussion? Reggie, call the roll.
Mr. Sprague?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Dr. Kopis?
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews?
Yes. All right, that concludes.
Just announce when our next meeting is.
Yes, yes, ma'am. That concludes our organizational meeting. Our next meeting will be Thursday, January 23rd at 4 p.m. right here at, on Dayton Street, 533 Dayton Street.
I'll make a motion to close.
Second.
Ms. Frazier, you can call the roll?
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Dr. Kopis?
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews?
Yes.
Mr. Sprague?
Yes.